Mr. Campbell?
Uh-huh.
What kind of power you got?
Oh, man, you know I got some soul power.
What kind of power you
What
got?
kind of question is that? I got soul power.
Yes, you do.
Right on. Let me ask you something now, Mr. Bertier.
Yes.
How strong are you?
I'm too strong.
What? How strong?
I'm too strong.
How strong?
Too strong.
Right on,
I want a
man.
victory.
Oh, I want a victory.
I want a victory.
No, I want a victory.
You want victory?
Well, whether you're joining us from Annapolis online, the chapel, wherever you are in Odenton, thanks for being here. My name's Aaron. I'm one of our pastors, and I just got to say, Remember the Titans is a great movie. It's not even up for debate. It's the greatest sports movie of all time, okay? I won't entertain any others. I am a bit of an expert. I have seen like 2 other sports movies, so I'm pretty sure I'm correct on this one. But it's a great movie, just so much about it. But anyway, I think that scene is super interesting. There's so much emotion, they're so hyped. You're like, ah! They're also the oldest high schoolers that have ever existed. If I were playing that team in football as a high schooler, I would remember those Titans, okay? Those are large individuals. But anyway, what's the purpose of those questions that Coach Boone is screaming at them, right? Is he asking them, those players, is he asking them questions about strategy? Are those questions about blocking schemes and open field tackling? No, that's not what he's yelling at them. He's asking them vocabulary questions, right? And their answers are kind of weird. What are you? You're mobile, agile, hostile. What is pain? It's French bread. What is fatigue? It's army clothes. What's going on? Right? Well, what's the value in those questions? Well, clearly it's not in the words themselves necessarily. The value is of the ritual is in the ethos that it creates for the identity of that team. The ethos it makes is an ethos of toughness, of endurance, right? They are being trained to literally forget the normal meanings of the word pain and fatigue, right? Why? That sets a tone. The tone is, will you ever quit? No, we will never quit. We want some more. We want some more, right? Those chants, they're like a catechism. They're our form of discipleship into the way that the Titans do business. This is who we are, and this is how we do it around here. Okay? And there are lots of examples of this kind of thing, outside of the sports world and in the sports world. If I think in the sports world, in real life, I think of the New England Patriots, whatever you think of them and their ridiculous winning streak with Brady and Belichick. For them, it was the phrase, do your job, right? That's the ethos of that team. Sound fundamentals, perfect execution, no drama, don't talk to the media, do your job. Also, lots of cheating, but that's different. It's different. What are some other examples of that? Well, for Muhammad Ali, it was float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, right? That's the ethos. For the USMC, right? Semper Fi. For the Navy, it's don't give up the ship. For the Army, who knows? I don't know. They forgot it apparently during the football game this year, whatever it was. That felt good. Come on, I thought this was a Navy town. I thought maybe an applause, something. I don't know, maybe. Go Navy, beat Army. I don't know what the Space Forces is either. They're new enough. I think they're still coming up with it, okay? I don't know what theirs is. But these mantras exist because sometimes it's helpful to have sort of a defining metaphor. Whether that's a phrase, it's a quote, it's a mental image, something that encapsulates what kind of a person, what kind of a team we're going to be. Why is that helpful? Well, it's helpful because it serves as a guiding light in the midst of a tough moment on the field or in battle when you're saying, this is hard, this is confusing, this is scary. What should flood into your mind in that moment? Well, if you're a Titan, what should come into your mind is, as you're hurting, laying there, what is pain? It's French bread. I want some more, right? That simple chant actually provides clarity in the middle of the battle. Okay, so why am I talking about Denzel Washington right now? Because it's a really good movie. That's it. No, I'm just kidding. Why am I talking about it? I think we're talking about it because what I see in 2 Timothy chapter 2, where we're going to be this morning, I see some things that come from the Apostle Paul that are a lot like the questions that Coach Boone is asking his players. Paul is going to give to his young protege named Timothy some defining sayings that I think help clarify the ethos of our team as followers of Jesus. They serve in some ways as like the soul of our team. It's the way we do our business. mental images that I think can provide some clarity in the heat of the moment. So join me, if you would, in 2 Timothy chapter 2. That's where we're going to be this morning, 2 Timothy 2. We're exploring this passage together in the month of January, and I'm excited to continue in it. If you weren't here last week, Brian Hopper, the Annapolis campus pastor, kicked off our exploration of this chapter. He gave us some really helpful background on what's going on in 2 Timothy, and who wrote it and what was happening in that context. He reminded us that Paul, who was the prolific missionary, author, pastor from the first century, he wrote this letter, and he was, at one time in his life, radically anti-Jesus, but he became the most powerful agent for Jesus. And he's writing this letter to a young pastor in training, his friend named Timothy. And Paul is writing this at the end of his life, near the end of his life. He's imprisoned in Rome as he's writing. And so the tone of the letter is both very personal to a friend and also very urgent. It's urgent because this is his last chance to impart the reminders that he thinks Timothy, and actually all of Timothy's followers, are going to need to hear. And so as we read this letter, we always have to keep two audiences in mind. We've got Timothy directly. Paul's writing to Timothy directly. But he's also writing to the people that Timothy would lead. That's us by extension. Paul is meaning to shape not just a person, but also a movement with this letter. So he's carefully measuring his words. He knows that his last words will be lasting words. And this is a bit of like a, hey, before I go type message from Paul. That's what this is. I think about it a little bit like the list of commands that my wife and I kind of rattle off to our kids before we leave, maybe to like go on a date or just to leave our children alone in the house or whatever. But as we're walking out the door, maybe for a date night, whatever, we might be saying to the boys like, okay, hey boys, listen up. Like, we're going to obey, the babysitter, they're in charge. We're going to obey their words. Make sure after dinner you take responsibility for your plates. They go into, the sink. And, okay, if you go to the basement, make sure you turn off the lights. We've been leaving the lights on. No screens after 7 o'clock. And boys, hey, listen to me. Look, hey, no wrestling with the turtle. Okay, we've talked about this. Leave the turtle alone, okay? Listen, okay, if you need me, numbers on the fridge, all this kind of stuff, and then try to sneak out before the youngest knows that we're leaving, That's kind of how that goes. It's amazing how many things I remember that I need to say to my kids, like on the threshold as you're exiting the scene, right? That's a bit like what's going on here for Paul. These are his rapid fire commands and ideas to his protege as he's exiting the scene. So I think we should, zoom in. We should listen up to these. Because if we're in a year that we are trying to become more like Jesus as a church, what better way to do that than to get the final brain dump, right, of the most prolific leader of the early church movement? Throughout our passage, Paul is giving rapid-fire commands in 2 Timothy 2. Look at just a few. In verse 1, he says, be strengthened in the grace that's in Christ Jesus. Verse 2, what you've heard from me, entrust to others. Verse 3, he says, hey, share in the suffering. Verse 15, do your best to present yourself to God approved. Verse 16, avoid irreverent babble. He's just firing off commands here. And in the midst of all of that to-do list, he's also saying, hey, as you're doing those things, think over what I say. Verse 7. Verse 8, remember Jesus Christ. And then there's this verse that gave us the series title. Paul says in verse 14, remind them of these things. Clearly, there are basic truths that Paul thinks need to be rehearsed and remembered if discipleship is going to happen. And I'm excited that we get to spend so much time this month of January in this passage, just sifting through the reminders from Paul to Timothy. Last week, Brian introduced a spiritual growth assessment. We've already talked about it already this morning. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to take that. It's part of our process of becoming more like Jesus this year. And then Brian walked us through verses 1 and 2, where we remembered that grace is what will carry us as we're becoming more like Jesus. And he also reminded us from verse 2 that passing on this disciple-making process, passing that on to somebody who will also make disciples, that is the lifelong calling of every believer. Those are amazing reminders. And so what is it that Paul turns to next? Well, let's look at verse 3. Here's what it says. It says, share in suffering as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Okay, well, what's this about? The context of this whole letter is actually suffering. Okay, Paul is suffering. Timothy will soon be suffering. There are people who have recently abandoned the faith because of suffering. It's a motif that runs through the letter. We're going to be talking about it again very specifically in 2 weeks. But this phrase, share in suffering, this command, it's interesting because it's probably best understood to mean take your share of the suffering. Take your share of the suffering. It has a sense of sort of shared responsibility, which is why he brings up soldiers, right? Because soldiers understand that part of what it means to be a soldier is to have a willingness to take your share of the hard stuff, for the sake of the others in your unit, right? Like, I'll take my part. And Paul wants Timothy to think of religious persecution that he is and will experience as just taking his lumps as part of the team. It was assumed associating with Jesus would bring you difficulty. So take your share. The way we say it around here is that discipleship is costly. It's one of the 9 discipleship essentials. You've got to understand this about discipleship. It's costly. Now, I would say, thankfully, we don't experience costs in our country and in this time in the same way that Paul and Timothy would have experienced them. But this idea still applies, that we should take our share of the lumps when it comes to following Jesus and the hardships that produces. So that leads me to think, just as we're getting started, that if following Jesus never costs us anything, financially or reputationally or in terms of how we spend our time or our priorities, if it never costs us anything, I think we ought to have some concerns. It's hard to obey a command that says, hey, take your share of the suffering, if we can't think of a single way that our commitment to Jesus has been costly. We got to take our share of the lumps. That's what a good soldier does. And it's at this point, he's just told them to take his share of the suffering, that Paul lays out the 3 sayings that are designed to shape the team's culture. Okay, we're finally circling back to Remember the Titans where we started. Okay, in verse 4, 5, and 6, Paul's going to give one statement per verse that is a defining saying. It's meant to provide some amount of insight about the way that our team is going to operate under pressure. Okay, so almost as if he's saying, hey, Timothy, suffering is here. It's coming. But the question is, who are we going to be in the midst of the hard times? Who are we going to be when the going gets tough? How do we do business? And the statements that he gives in verse 4, 5, and 6 are the culture-shaping answer to the question. This is how we do. But I'll be honest, when you first read them, they seem a little random. Maybe you're reading along, you're like, okay, I'm tracking with you, Paul. I get where you're headed. Then you get to verse 4, I think, and you're a little bit like, at least I was like, what? Where did this come from? Like, I now have no clue what you're talking about, Paul. And I think that Paul actually kind of realizes that. Like in verse 4, 5, and 6, he says these statements that like he knows them to be profound, but he just kind of lobs them out there and is like, yeah, you know what? And then in verse 7, he's like, it'll make sense later. Look what he says in verse 7. Think over what I say. The Lord will give you understanding and everything. It's like, you'll understand when you're older. You're going to have to think about this for a little bit, okay? He can sort of picture Timothy's confused face. He's like, trust me, these are good. You're going to like them. And I would venture a guess that Coach Boone probably had to do the same thing, right? When he first taught the Titans that the proper answer to the question, what is pain, is French bread. I would imagine there's a little bit of confusion there, right? Probably seemed a little random. But after a while, once you think about it, you start to see like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing. I see where you're taking this. Okay, so that's what I want to do this morning, okay? I want to show you the 3 sayings and hopefully explain them in a way that you can see like, hey, this is defining our team's culture. It actually gives helpful guardrails that are going to keep us on track when we face pressure in becoming more like Jesus. Okay, so what are these 3 sayings? Let's jump into the first one. We see it in verse 4. Here we go. For the first one. No soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuits, since his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. Okay, like I said, sort of out of nowhere, we have this hard left. All of a sudden, we were talking about soldiers, and so he says another random statement about soldiers. And what he says is, here's what soldiers do, and here's why they do it. Okay, so let's look at both those things. What is it that soldiers do? Well, he says soldiers don't get entangled in civilian pursuits. Now, okay, these statements, you have to think about them as general principles, a little bit like a proverb or a wisdom statement. The point of this is not to be like, well, actually, some soldiers have been known to become entangled. It's like, no, okay, you're not getting the point. But that's not what we're doing here. Paul's saying no soldier in good standing that has been recruited and deployed for the purpose of war fighting, that kind of soldier does not get entangled in civilian pursuits. And I think that's a really interesting point, because the question is, what are civilian pursuits? Right? Like, are they bad things? Are they immoral things? No, not necessarily, right? Like, civilian things aren't bad. They're just not military things. They're non-urgent, non-mission critical things. You should be able to assume that a soldier isn't getting entangled in promoting the enemy's cause, right? That's treason. That's the immoral stuff. That's inherently bad. That's not what Paul is talking about. He's saying a good soldier discerns in their daily activities which things are critical to war fighting and which things are non-essential and thus better left to people who don't have orders, civilians. Paul's first statement here is a statement of prioritization. And he says no soldier gets entangled. And I think that word entangled is interesting. It's the idea of being like held back from doing something that you would otherwise want to do. So you're being restrained by something you've gotten caught up in. And Paul says soldiers don't do that. They don't let themselves get caught up in nonsense. But how? How do they avoid getting stuck in nonsense? Well, they do that by purposefully steering clear of anything that could potentially trip them up from being battle ready. They don't get entangled. And why do they do that? He actually gives us a sense of the motive. A soldier doesn't get entangled because his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. He says they're discerning in how they invest their effort because they want to please their commanding officer. And since their goal is clear, I should keep the CO happy, it actually provides them with great clarity about what they ought to do and what they ought to not do. It functions as a clarifier in their life. Because let's be honest, if you're thinking about it, the line between what's a soldier thing and what's a civilian thing, it might not always be that easy to figure out. But soldiers that are successful, Paul says, they're able to tell the difference. How? By asking themselves, what are my CO's priorities? What matters most to them? Their priorities become the gauge for me, what is worthwhile and what's a distraction. I ask, what would please the CO? So what is it that Paul's getting at? Like I said, it might seem a little bit like a random truism about how a soldier ought to be. It's a little bit out of the blue, but I think he's defining our team's MO. Hey guys, what are we like under pressure? And I think this saying about a soldier makes it clear. Becoming more like Jesus under pressure will require focus. It will require focus. What are we like under pressure? We're focused. If we're going to do this, it requires us to discern between what is good and what is best. And for us to be willing to pay the price of laser focus, of conscious neglect, of knowingly allowing other priorities that could otherwise be good, allowing those to suffer in favor of the things which would please our commanding officer. And frankly, that can be pretty clarifying in life. If we're asking ourselves what would please God, it actually can help us make decisions. Becoming more like Jesus under pressure requires focus. But that should prompt us, I think, to ask some maybe uncomfortable questions about how it is that we're functioning in our daily life. If Paul's right, if this is our team's culture, then the journey of becoming more like Jesus is going to require focus. So I think we got to ask, am I distracted by the wrong things? Am I distracted by the wrong things? If we're soldiers that have been deployed by our Savior for His purposes, are there civilian pursuits that we're allowing to trip us up? These don't have to be things that are wrong. These are just things that are out of balance. Things that are getting mission-critical resources even though they're a luxury item. And I'm not going to pretend like I know exactly what areas, everyone might be struggling in. But I would say when it comes to our priorities spiritually or in our family life or in our career or in our finances, whatever, I'd venture a guess that most of us could probably benefit from an audit, right? A chance to just step back and kind of evaluate. Are my time, energy, resources, my focus, are they going to things that are spiritually mission critical for a soldier that's deployed in an active war zone? Or are they things that should be better left to those without orders? And actually, we're going to give you a chance at the end of this message to ask this question and a few others throughout the message. We'll have a chance to reflect on that. So just sort of put a bookmark there. We'll circle back around. Am I distracted by the wrong things? I think though there is another question that this particular saying causes us to ask. It's a little bit deeper. Remember, Paul said, no soldier gets entangled since his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. In other words, Paul is operating on the assumption that a soldier would want to please his CO. But to be honest, that's not automatic. So I think we need to ask, am I distracted by the wrong motivations? Not just the wrong things, but the wrong motivations. It is possible to do the right things for the wrong reasons. Paul is assuming, of course, a soldier wants to please his CO, but we can't assume that about ourselves. I mean, is pleasing God my highest aim? My highest goal? Or is it pleasing myself? Or my spouse? Or keeping my boss off my back? Or maintaining my reputation? Or making money? Or getting clicks? Like, what's my highest motivation? There are lots of motivations out there. Am I motivated by pleasing God? And look, there are so many motives. Some of them are so tricky that they could actually lead us seemingly toward the right kinds of behavior for a time, right? But I'm convinced that only a heart-level commitment to pleasing God and pleasing God for his own sake, only that will sustain us over the course of our deployment. We have to be committed to pleasing God. Am I distracted by the wrong motivations? Again, we'll have a chance to ask those questions of ourselves here in just a little bit. But when it comes to this sermon, I don't want us to get lost in what's going on here in the passage. I don't want those questions to take us away from that. Do you see what Paul has just done in this saying? It's a seemingly random thing about a soldier, but it helps to define our team's culture, and it does it in a way that's very useful. Because think about it, if I'm under pressure in the midst of following Jesus in my Christian life, if I'm tempted in the midst of that because of the pressure to chase after something frivolous, or to just ultimately please myself or others more than I'm motivated by pleasing Jesus, in the heat of that moment, what I can remind myself of is like, oh yeah, soldiers don't get tied up. They don't get entangled in civilian pursuits. That's not how we operate. That's not how we do. I got to get back to how we do business. Just like a Titan who just took a big hit on the football field could say to himself, flat on his back, pain is French bread, right? That's clarifying in the midst of battle. It blocks out the shock of the moment. We can use these statements to refocus our heart and minds on what matters most to us rather than what we feel in the moment. No soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuits. I'm trying to please my CO. That's clarifying. The soldier helps us see that becoming more like Jesus under pressure requires focus. So he's just talked about soldiers. What's the next saying? Verse 5. Hard turn. An athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. Like I said, we just switched gears, no clutch. Now we're talking about athletes, okay? From soldiers to athletes. Now I know we have some soldiers here in the room, and I want to be clear, he's not saying that no soldier is an athlete, okay? I think you guys are athletes, okay? You're great. That's it. Okay, I don't want to offend too many soldiers. Sometimes I do. I will make fun of one of the branches, and then I'm like, why am I fighting this, making people mad who could kill me? Why am I doing this? This is a bad idea. So you guys are athletes. I just wanted to compliment you. Thank you for your service. So athletic. I don't want to give anyone my address. Okay, so no. What's he talking about here? He's talking about athletes all of a sudden. He's saying that in an athletic competition, it is not enough that you merely cross the finish line first. Because how you got to that point matters. Crossing first doesn't matter if you cheated and jumped on a horse in the middle of the race, right? The how matters just as much as the what. Especially in their culture, athletes actually had to take a vow, not just about how they would compete during the competition itself. They actually had to sign on to a series of vows about how long they would prepare and in what ways they would train just to enter the competition. They had to vow to do all those things. Now, once again, of course, we can all think of athletes who have won competitions while cheating. Okay, I will never forgive the 2017 Astros. There will always be an asterisk on that World Series. If you know, you know. But that's not the point, okay? The principle here is that in athletics, cheaters never prosper. How you train and compete is as important as winning the race. So how does this help to define our team's culture? Well, I think Paul is saying that becoming more like Jesus under pressure requires not just focus, but also integrity. It requires focus and integrity. Paul's saying, hey guys, we aren't the team that cuts corners. For us, the ends do not justify the means. The process is as important as the product. So we do what we say we're going to do. We do it right when nobody's watching. We follow the rules even when the refs can't see it. Even if everyone else is cheating, we operate with integrity because for us, winning isn't winning if you cheated to get the win. That's our team's culture. That's what Paul's laying out. And so if that's true, I think that leads us to another difficult question, which would be, in my spiritual growth, where am I tempted to cheat the process? Where am I tempted to cheat the process? Becoming more like Jesus isn't just about the externals of looking like we're winning. It's about our character. It's about who we are when no one's watching. It's about how we treat those who have nothing to offer us in return. It's about trusting that our growth, not only our growth, but the growth of others around us, maybe who are under our influence, all of our growth, it might be slower than we would want because we're unwilling to force the growth to happen in a way that would not honor God. If we try to conform it to our schedule, we'll do it wrong. And so things are going to go a little slower than we'd like. And to be honest, I just think all of us are tempted in so many areas of our life to shortchange the process in favor of a quick win, right? To fudge the numbers a little. In life, in discipleship, in parenting, in marriage, in school, at work, there is almost always a right way and an easy way, and they are almost never the same. Almost never. I wish they converged a little more often. They rarely do. The truth is, our team knows that under pressure, only the athletes who compete according to the rules get the prize. So we don't cut corners. I know for me, this can be such a hard area to contend with. It can be. I can't tell you how often I'm tempted to want to escape whatever lesson God is trying to teach me in whatever my pressure spot is this day or month or week or season. I mean, very often I would like to press whatever the easy button is or fast forward a little bit just to find some way to kind of microwave my current season of life so that I can get on with what I think my priorities ought to be for God, right? I got to remember, only the athletes who compete according to the rules get the prize. I don't get to cheat the system and ignore my responsibilities and pretend that my weaknesses don't exist just so I can skip to the next thing and try to look good doing it. I mean, the truth is, people will let you do that, and they'll probably applaud you while you do. This saying calls me to faithfulness instead of flashiness. That's hard. Yeah. I wonder what it might call out in you. Only the athlete that competes according to the rules gets the crown. That's saying two. Let's look at the last one in verse 6. Hard turn again. It is the hard-working farmer who ought to have the first share of the crops. Okay, soldier, now an athlete, now a farmer. What's going on here? Well, I want to point out two things that Paul's doing. He describes a trait about this farmer, but I think he also picked the occupation of farming for a very specific reason. Okay, so I want to look at both of those things. Let's look first at the trait, okay? Paul says that this is the hardworking farmer. And the adjective in the original language is actually front-loaded in the sentence for the purpose of making it the emphasis, okay? Hardworking is meant to be stated in contrast to its opposite. He's saying it's the hardworking farmer as opposed to the lazy farmer, right? So that's what he's trying to say. He's emphasizing the hardworkingness of this particular person. But farming as an occupation was not a random selection for Paul. What do I mean? Well, farming, for them culturally, would be the equivalent of like small business ownership for us today. It's a very normal, meaningful, respectable way to make a living. But I think that farming was consciously chosen as the metaphor specifically because of the type of work that farming requires. Farming obviously is highly labor intensive, but I think most importantly, the reason that Paul picked it is that even though it's labor intensive, the vast majority of the time when you are farming, it is extremely hard to see any type of results coming from your backbreaking labor. Most of what you do seemingly produces very little that is tangible, right? Farmers cannot look at their Q2 numbers of weed pulling and see how things are going, right? It's hard, and progress is slow. And frankly, profits are completely non-existent until you get to the harvest. So why is farming the perfect occupation, I think, to make Paul's point? It's because farming requires immense amount of work without immediate satisfaction or results. Thus, he's saying, only the farmers who did not stop working in the spring or on the bad weather days, only the farmer who sticks with it in the worst of the summer heat, instead of giving up because it's clearly hard or giving up because they don't see results, it's only that hardworking farmer who is rewarded with the profits at the harvest. And I think that dynamic is a particularly pronounced quirk of farming. Lots of work, it's all up front, very little results until you get to the end. And so what's Paul's point for us? How does this shape our culture? He's saying becoming more like Jesus under pressure requires, yes, focus, yes, integrity, but also diligence. Diligence. He's highlighting the importance of diligence in our spiritual lives. What is diligence? Diligence, I would define it as constant effort combined with patience. Constant effort combined with patience. It is the dogged insistence on doing the right things and accepting all of the physical toll and the strain that comes from your responsibilities, and doing that even when the sun is out, and when the plants are the same height that they were yesterday, and when there's no boss, nobody's looking over your shoulder, there is no time card, there's very little accountability. That is diligence. And that's what Paul wants us to see. That's a significant part of the ethos of the team of those who are becoming more like Jesus. Doing this under pressure will require diligence. We need to be willing to take on our share of the suffering. Focus on what matters to our commanding officer. Have integrity as we go about our lives, no matter what anyone else does. And we will not stop doing those things just because we don't see the results that we want on day 2, on week 2, on month 2, on year 2, on decade 2. The hard-working farmer gets the harvest. Under pressure, we remember that diligence is the difference in the harvest. Becoming more like Jesus under pressure requires focus, integrity, and diligence. And so what question does this force us to ask? I think it forces us to ask, where am I being tempted to throw in the towel? Where am I being tempted to throw in the towel? Where in my spiritual life does the effort no longer feel like it's worth it? Where do I feel like, I'd just rather take some time off? I'm weary of paying this cost. Could someone else do the distribution of seeds? Can someone else do the watering and the weeding? I'll come back around at harvest time. What is that area of our lives? And look, this is not to say that there's no space for rest. Of course not. Resting in Jesus is vital. Being strengthened in grace is what Paul was talking about 5 verses ago. Of course there's room for rest. In fact, God literally invented the idea of resting during our work week. He didn't need to rest. He set an example for us so that we would. Rest is great. But I do think for us, when it comes to our spiritual lives, it is easier to confuse our need for rest with a temptation toward laziness. It's easier to confuse those things than we like to think. Are we tempted to throw in the towel? When we get to that moment, Paul wants us to snap back to clarity by remembering, what's our team's ethos? It's diligence in the face of pressure. Only the hardworking farmer receives the reward of the harvest. But I want you to notice something here about all 3 of these sayings. They all have a cost and a reward. A cost and a reward. Soldiers get the reward of their CO's approval, but only if they're focused. Athletes get the reward of the crown, but only if they have integrity. Farmers get the reward of payment in the form of a harvest, but only if they show diligence. And when it comes to spiritual rewards, I got to say, of course, spiritual rewards are always the product of grace. Grace that has been lavished on us, the perfect righteousness of Jesus exchanged onto our account when we gave him our sins that he fully paid for on the cross, vindicated in his resurrection. It's all of grace, of course. But our experience of those spiritual blessings, both in this life and the next, are in fact connected to our willingness to submit to God's ways and to function in the family of God according to the ethos that he defined for his family. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are rewards to be gained, there are blessings to be received for functioning in the way that God designed. And Paul is making it clear from the soldier, the athlete, and the farmer that becoming more like Jesus requires focus, integrity, and diligence. And for those who choose to live this way, there are blessings to be harvested. Paul would say it this way in the same letter, just a few chapters over as he's ending. He says to Timothy, he's like, brother, I fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I've kept the faith. AKA, I've paid the cost. I've taken my share of the suffering. And what does this mean? It means that henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but to all those who have loved his appearing. Do you see the connection here? Finishing the race, having done it the right way by God's power, results in reward. That's what Paul wanted Timothy to keep in front of his people. He says, hey, Pastor Timothy, make sure you're preaching this to your flock. And it's what I think we need to keep in mind as well. We need to remember the lessons of the soldier, the athlete, and the farmer. Remember that becoming more like Jesus under pressure requires focus, integrity, and diligence. But maybe you're here and you're feeling like, okay, this is a little bit vague. Like, okay, great thoughts. Thank you for the questions. But I'm not really sure how to take these questions and make them tangible in my own life. I don't know, what my priorities ought to be, whatever. I get that. I'll admit I'm tempted to maybe want to give you a whole bunch of specifics about what this could mean for your life, but at the same time, I'm hesitant to do that because I don't want to be overly prescriptive and tell you, here's how you ought to apply these questions and here's what's going on in people's lives, because what could be perfectly appropriate as a priority for one person might be wrong for someone else, and I don't want to feel like I'm in the position of telling you. Well, most of the answers to these difficult questions are very specific to you, your personality, your wiring, your calling, your stage of life, all those things. So here's what I want to do. I want to take Paul's advice from verse 7, and I want you to think over what he has said, because the Lord will give us understanding in everything. Okay? I want us to collectively take a moment here and seek the Lord and turn our hearts toward these statements, these questions, and ask the Lord what he might be up to in our lives. I believe we can gain a heart of wisdom. I believe that Paul is right when he says the Lord will give us understanding in everything. So what we're going to do is I just want to give you 2 minutes here in just a moment to pray. We'll put the questions that I've asked in the sermon up on the screen. You'll have 2 minutes. Just pray, contemplate, journal, think it over, notes on your phone, whatever would be most helpful to you, to bring it before the Lord and ask the Spirit, what is it that you're doing in my life this week through these questions? What ways might I need to make changes? And then at the end of those 2 minutes, we'll come back up here. I'll make a couple of statements, and then we're actually going to transition to a time where you can share for a couple of minutes with the people around you. Okay? Don't panic. Once again, we always arrange the seating that you're guaranteed to be within at least 3 seats of an extrovert. It's going to be okay. Someone else can carry the weight of the conversation if you need them to. No problem. But you'll get a chance to share. It's amazing how much more concrete things become when we have a chance to verbalize it and articulate it. So we're just going to take 2 minutes right now. Pray. I'm going to ask you to think over what has been said, believing that the Lord will give you understanding in everything. Let's take 2 minutes. Okay, so hopefully the Lord's highlighting a question or an area of your life that might need attention. So we're going to give you a couple minutes to share with the people around you. Again, you could just maybe share which question stood out to you the most, or you could go so far as to be vulnerable, sharing an area of weakness in your life that you want to see what God might be up to there, what step you might want to take this week, whatever would be great, best to share. I think it's just a helpful exercise for us to do this together. So let's take 2 minutes, and then I'll close us out once we're done with that. Well, my Bay Area family, I love hearing all the chatting. That's amazing. I just want to say, in the words of Paul in 2 Timothy, I believe that if we are strengthened in the grace that is made available to us in Christ Jesus, then we'll be able to take these statements, these 3 ideas that can define the ethos of our team, and we can live by them such that we can get to the end of our life and say, I fought the good fight, I've kept the faith, I've finished the race, and so we're eager to receive the crown that is the reward for a life of faithfulness to Christ. I'm believing for that. I'm praying for that this week. I hope you guys have a great rest of your Sunday. We'll see you next Sunday as we continue in 2 Timothy 2.